Hey everybody. So last week we asked you to give us a bunch of suggestions as we plan our videos for the next few months, and Kelly had a really good suggestion, so Kelly, we're going to get in contact with you, send you the wallet we made last week. Kelly suggested a really simple cuff that's not too big, not too crazy, and we realized we haven't done a lot of cuffs. It's a simple project, but the way that we're going to do it this week, we're going to show you how to make a cuff that has no closure. We're going to use some copper stock, and we're going to wrap the copper in leather to make a leather bracelet with a copper core. And it's really simple, but it's really, really classy, and it's a good project if you're getting into sort of wrapping things in leather, if you want to get into a little bit more dimensional work. So this is just a 1/2-inch copper bar you get from the hardware store, around the edges. And this is 6.5 inches long. This will make a large bracelet. I have pretty big wrists. You're gonna wanna go like 5.5 inches long if you have smaller wrists. And all you need besides that is just a little bit of leather. I'm just using an offcut from the belly of a hide. This is about 3 ounces, and the thing with this is you probably wanna go with, you could do it with veg tan, you do it with whatever you want. In order for us not to really have to wet mold anything, this is like a tumbled waxed leather. It'll work perfect, but it's a little bit more stretchy, and you don't need much. So all I'm going to do is, because I'm using a 1/2-inch piece of copper, I'm going to cut 2 1-inch strips of this leather, and I'm going to cut them probably, give myself probably about 1 inch on each side, so like 8.5 inches long. So now we need to basically glue this all together. It's a really simple project, but there's a little bit of nuance to it. So we don't want to glue the actual copper. We want it to kind of be floating in the middle, because once we sew everything up and get everything burnished, we need to bend this into a bracelet shape. And if we glue everything together, that's not going to really work, because it's just like when you fold and bifold, you need to have a little bit of play so that the materials can sort of shift inside one another. So what I'm going to do, since I have a 1/2-inch piece of copper, 1/2 inch wide, and I have a 1-inch piece of leather, I need to get a 1/4 inch. I'm going to use a Sharpie and just mark a 1/4 inch in from either side, and then kind of like just a little tiny bit on either end, because as you bend this around, your edges are going to the copper's going to push out. So we want to give it a little bit of room to play. All I'm going to do is use the lines on my cutting board to just mark a 1/4 inch like this, and I'm just going to go all the way down. And the only thing is, if you're using a Sharpie, be careful that it's not going to go through the leather. That only happens on super thin leathers, but if this would be a project where you could use like an upholstery leather or something really thin if you wanted to. And so there we go. And then I'm going to bring my copper in, and I'm not going to give you exact measurements, because you can cut this to whatever width and whatever length that you want to fit whoever you're making this for. And like I said, I'm just going to go kind of maybe a 1/8 of an inch out, and this is going to give me my glue surface. So I'm going to glue basically all around the outsides, but then when it comes time to sandwich this in between, I want to drop this in to the area with no glue, and that'll kind of let it float in between the 2 layers of leather. It's not going to be stuck in to the leather. Alright, so this is kind of the trickiest part. So I've glued all around our border here, and then I've let it pretty much dry up. If you're using contact cement, that's the way you want to do this. Let it get almost dry to the touch. It'll be a little bit tacky, but you don't want it to stick to your finger. And we're going to take our copper bar, and we're just going to place it in the middle here. And if it's touching a little bit of glue, that's really no big deal. Like that. We're going to take our other piece, and we're going to do our best to sort of line it up on top, like that. And now, this is a little different than anything we've ever shown you how to do. Because we're going to kind of be molding it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press down And our goal is not for these edges to line up because we're going to trim this whole thing. And because we're also sort of stretching this leather, you're going to find the reason that we used such a large piece of leather is because a lot of this is going to, this seam is going to suck in. So I have my bone folder here. You're probably going to want a bone folder. And all I'm going to do is just gently start to go in. And you can see where this is getting sucked up. And you're going to want to do it on kind of both sides evenly, like you're like with lug nuts. You go in a star pattern so that the tension remains sort of even when you're putting a wheel on. We're going to go down one side, and then we're going to go down the other. And what we're looking for is to really solidify this glue so that this part can't shift in the middle of the leather. And then you can kind of smooth everything out. And then we're going to go to the ends and we're going to work around like this. And this is why waiting till your glue is almost dry is very important, because we're really depending here on this glue to stick as strongly as it can because it's holding all this tension all along this piece. And this isn't really that difficult. I'd say to start, try this with a little bit more of a stretchy leather, and then you can move up to doing really firm vegged hands, and you can wet mold things and all that kind of stuff if you'd like. So that's all I'm doing. And then if you're using a bone folder like this, you can use the large side, and that'll get you a nice straight line. And I'm kind of pushing down and in to this corner. I'm not just pressing down, and I'm not just pressing against the side of the copper bar. And if you see, you'll start to see sort of a line forming here. I'll make it a little more visible for you. That's totally okay. We're not going to be using our dividers. We're just going to be stitching. We're going to use this as our stitch line, and we're going to stitch all the way down it. So that's totally fine. You're basically, you can think of this as your stitch groove. And I'm just going to go back and forth on this. When you think it's done, do it a little bit more, just for good measure. And every so often I'm going to come on top here, and even though there's no glue, we're just basically smoothing out this top. You don't want to go use the hard part, just use your flat, the flat part of your bone folder or whatever you're using. This is not one that you can get away with a Sharpie marker, unfortunately. But these are like a dollar or two at a craft store, so. And I think we're good. So now you can kind of see you have that nice dimension there. Looks really nice. So now we're going to trim this all up. So the first thing we're going to do is I am going to use my calipers, but for a different reason. I'm going to just gently mark my outside edge, and this is going to be roughly what I'm going to trim this to. We're going to do much more trimming and round it out and stuff. You just want to be careful that you're focusing on their outside edge. You don't want any real marks on the inside of this. The leather that we're using, you can kind of rub them out, but if you're not, that mark's just going to be there. So be careful with that. Then all I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off the excess here, and I'm going to trim off the excess here. And now, the tricky part is you can see that we have where our top layer of leather came down. We're about a 1/16 of an inch of leather. That's what we have to trim off. So I'm going to use the lines of my cutting board to sort of eye that up as best I can. And then I'm going to just try to do, and you want a very sharp blade, and this is not the time to try to make one pass through. I'm just going to go lightly and make a bunch of passes, because there's some very sliver thin stuff here, and it looks kind of wispy, but once we're all the way through, we have that nice clean edge, okay? And I'm going to do that on the other side too. And so now you've seen me do this before, but this is probably the most important step if you're looking to get a very clean edge, and it's also super simple. I actually, even though we have the edge slicker machine, when I'm making these, I prefer to do it this way because you have such a long, flat edge here that if you're using a drum sander, you gotta be really, really careful to try to get this straight. All I do, a little piece of sandpaper on a flat surface, and this is gonna make sure that our edges are super, super straight. And you're just gonna go back and forth. It helps to have like a full sheet of sandpaper. We're running low and I haven't restocked it yet. But little scraps like this work okay too. Okay, and you can see now when we put this down, it's perfectly, perfectly straight. Now I'm going to take my scratch awl and I'm going to make, you don't want to push down and cut the leather, but I'm just going to make a very razor sharp stitch line. And this is pretty much in lieu of our dividers like we would do on a normal wallet or stitch line. And then when we get to the edges, remember, because we're gonna curve this after it's all sewn up, we need a little bit of extra. Now you could use, let's see, you could dial your dividers in to a super small thing, distance, and kind of make your own mark. I'm just gonna freehand it. I only really go about 1/8 of an inch. And I'm just following this line. And this is going to come out for me like this, and out for me like that. So you can see our bar ends here. I'm only going to give it about 1/8 of an inch on each side. And it looks a little bit squiggly, but remember we're using that 0.6mm thread with the 5mm stitching irons that are a diamond shape, so that'll cover that perfectly. There we go. And now we're going to just go through and punch. And so when you're punching this, you want to make sure that you're going right in that groove. You don't want to come over, because if you punch straight into the copper, your tools aren't going to like you very much. But it's fairly easy. It's actually really nice because you have kind of this groove just built straight in, and you can just punch right down it. And then what I'm going to do, because if I use my 2-prong, we can see that the stitches aren't really even. So I'm going to use my 1-prong and kind of just eyeball it. I'm going to do 1 in the center, and then 2 on the sides. And because it's kind of on a curve at the end, it'll trick your eye into looking like it's fairly evenly spaced. We're going to do that on this side as well. So I'm going to start in the middle, and then I'm just going to fill in those 2 gaps. And there we go. And depending on, we're using the 5mm stitching irons from Weaver. Depending on what spacing you're using, depending on the thickness of the bar that you're using, yours could line up perfect. It just so happened that in this case it wasn't a perfect match, but we can always just eyeball it and make sure that it looks nice. So we're going to go with a 0.6mm Ritza Tiger thread. Link is in the description if you want to pick up any of the tools or anything we're using. You can sew one side and then the other if you want. I think I'm going to go around the whole thing. It's going to be like a comical amount of thread, but I think I can pull it off. I would suggest doing your back stitches at the ends here. It'll just kind of balance it out. You don't want like a double stitch directly in the middle on one side and on the other. This part will be under your wrist, so as you're wearing it you won't see a back stitch, even though back stitches look really nice when you're using this thread because it's flat and they lay nice. So I'm going to just eyeball it and take a bunch of thread here, and we'll just basically stitch this up. So now that we have the whole thing stitched up, we're just going to do our final trimming, and I'm going to do this by hand or by eye. If you want to use a strap end punch, you can do that too. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow that curve, and then I'm just going to round this out a little bit, just so we don't have any sharp edges that'll kind of curl over time, because this is going to get, because it's a bracelet, it's going to get touched a lot and all that kind of stuff. And if it's not perfect, don't worry, we're going to go in with sandpaper and kind of adjust this curve by hand. I tend to kind of whittle away at it when I'm doing stuff like this, because we're going to want this nice and smooth. Right. And so when I finish stuff like this, I do it kind of in a bunch of stages. What I'm going to do first is just focus on getting this nice and flat and getting it the shape that I want. And then we're going to go in with the edge beveler. We're going to bevel the edges, and then we're going to go back with more sandpaper, and we're going to work those edges even smoother before we do our final burnish. And on the corners, you can use your hand. You can also, if you want to wrap a little block of wood around a piece of sandpaper around a block of wood, that also works. I tend to use my fingers on a curve like this because it gets you, it's almost like using a sanding sponge, and you can see you kind of can get that nice curve in there. And then I'm just going to do this on the other side as well, and pay special attention to the transition where it goes from straight to curved, because remember, we want to make sure that we're knocking down any hard angles there. In the future, if you have a hard angle, it's just going to fold over and look kind of not so great. And so I think now I'm just going to hit this one more time on the straight edges with our flat sandpaper technique. And because we're doing a lot of, there's a lot of tension happening. We've folded, we've bent it. You're going to have like little wavy bits, and when you sand it down, you can kind of see a little bit there. We're going to sand all that down so that we're just basically re-flattening that edge. So our last step, while the piece is flat, we're going to just burnish, and I'm just going to go in with some gum trag here. You can use a wool dauber or whatever you want. I just use my fingers. And we don't want to totally saturate. Excuse me. We just want this to be sort of damp. So once you put it on, wait for a couple seconds, and you'll feel it kind of not tack up like glue, but just kind of dries out just a little bit. And then I'm just using, this is just cloth. And the cool thing about these bracelets is it's pretty rare that you have like a metal core keeping your piece stiff. So these things usually are pretty simple to shine up because they're not flopping around or anything like that. And then we're going to hit it like usual with a little bit of beeswax, and this is going to seal off for good all these fibers. As this is going to be, it's a bracelet, you're going to be probably exposing it to a little more water than normal, and a little extra beeswax is going to go a long way in making sure that liquid can't get into these open fibers on the edges. So this whole time we've done a really good job at making just a leather wrapped piece of copper. We need to put the curve in to make it a bracelet. So I'm just going to do this by hand. This is not easy, full disclosure. But I'm going to just slowly work my way. And when you're doing a bracelet like this, you're not really going for a round, right? Because you have your wrist is flat and flat. So you kind of want like a flat part on the top, and then you want some curves on the sides. So that's what we're going to aim for, but we want to go fairly slowly and just kind of ease it in. This is not very easy. I mean, I think you could probably make these bracelets, you could pre-bend and wrap. You could pre-bend the copper and then wrap it that way. This is way easier to get the leather on. It just takes a minute or two to get the curve in. And the big part is getting this to kind of bend over a little bit. There we go. And you can just kind of test, keep testing, and we're getting close. So now what I want to do is just get these to wrap that last little bit around. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a pair of totally flat needle nose pliers with a little bit of leather in between. So I have needle nose pliers here. You can see that they have a little bit of a texture, but they're old, they're fairly flat because we don't want to mark this leather. But to be extra careful, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a little piece of scrap here. I'm going to fold this around here. And I'm going to kind of go in and only get about that last inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch, right? And we're going to use the tension to make that final little curve. That's really hard to do. And there you go. We have that nice curve. So I got big, and then we have nothing sticking up there. And then you can kind of just, once you have the basic shape like this, and you see how that little extra bit that we left, we have no pushing, there's no any tension here because we don't want over time, if this has a lot of tension on it, you'll wear through that leather. But we have a little bit of play, and that way you can just kind of slide it on your wrist, squeeze it shut, and you're good to go. And so here we go. Kelly, I hope that this was what you had in mind. Very simple, minimalist bracelet option. No closures needed. It's not bulky at all. I don't wear a lot of bracelets, but if I do, I wear something like this because there's nothing to catch on anything. And it looks really cool, and it ages beautifully. Because you have that copper in there, you get some nice dark patina where it hits the edge here. This kind of stays a little more light. You can't really go wrong with this style. It's not too big, it's not too flashy. You can also go in, I was just playing around, this isn't even or anything, but this is just kind of a sample one that I was playing with. You can punch holes, and so the copper, or whatever metal, you can do this brass too, kind of shows through. Do it a little bit nicer than this though. This was just playing around. So you have tons of options. You can tool this, you can put spots or gems in it if you want. Yeah, so thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.